Good evening and welcome to the Nixon Seminar on Conservative Realism and National Security. I'm your host, Mary Kissel with Stevens, Inc. We're honored to once again have Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien co-chairing this discussion alongside our outstanding seminar members. And today, we're marking the 50th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords and the end of American involvement in the ground war in Vietnam. What are the lessons of that war? How do wars end? Or given the Chinese spy balloon that floated over our nation this week, how do wars begin? So, Secretary Pompeo, I'm going to start with you, sir. Vietnam, Nixon wrote a book called No More Vietnams, and he said very clearly, we won that war. It wasn't us that lost it, it was Congress that lost it. Do you agree?
On this, I've read Nixon's book there. I read his subsequent writings on this same issue as well. I don't know that you can pin the blame on Congress. When he says we won it, it's not clear exactly what he meant by we either. In the end, and we certainly faced this when we were in office, we had a conflict that had been dragging on for decades. American people thought there were too many lives lost. Striking similarities, very different context, but striking similarities in terms of American popular opinion. I think Nixon had the objective right, and that's always the challenge, is to say, what are we there for? What is the goal? What's the objective? What does winning look like? What is the cost of failure to win? And I describe that, I use that very carefully, as opposed to losing, right? There's also all this gray area, which is you didn't lose, but you certainly did better than had you done nothing. And I think if you characterize it the way Nixon did in that interview, we certainly ended up, the West, America, ended up in a far better place as a result of the decisions we made strategically, whether every tactical decision was right, every resource allocation was right, whether we had it right in the end of the 60s or the beginning of the 70s, which were two very different parts of the conflict. Those are for historians to debate. In the end, I think the objective, the reason that we went to fight there was real and important. We're seeing this same conflict play out in Ukraine today. And leaders, statesmen, have to try to get right what it means if you do nothing. Make that case to the American people. And in this instance, I think President Nixon has done, as a historical matter, a nice job of explaining why the work, all the costs that he accounted for there, all those costs were worthy and put America in a better place than it would have been without them.
Well, it is true. And Nixon says in his book, No More Vietnams, I commend it to everybody to read, the remarkable fact that over these, I think, 5 presidencies, the aim was very clear. It was to stop the spread of communism through Indochina. Ambassador O'Brien, Secretary Pompeo was alluding to the potential parallel with the war in Afghanistan. It lasted over several presidencies. Was the aim there similarly always clear, always agreed on, regardless of whether or not the president was a Republican or a Democrat?
Well, I think if you're asking about Afghanistan, Mary, the aim was clear. We'd suffered a grievous attack on the homeland in 9/11. The attack had been originated and planned in Afghanistan. And our goal was to make sure that Afghanistan could never be a safe haven again for terrorists and for those who would do harm to Americans and our allies. And in that sense, we were successful. Like Nixon said with Vietnam, in Afghanistan, we were successful. We eliminated al-Qaeda as a functioning element, although remnants remained. And we made sure that there was not an attack on the American homeland. We did it at a very high cost. And part of that is because the goals in Afghanistan changed. It changed from making sure that Afghanistan could no longer be a safe haven and to a point where we wanted to build a nation in Afghanistan. And I was part of that in the Bush administration. I spent many years working on a rule of law program in Afghanistan, trying to help the Afghans develop a country that they could be proud of, a democracy, a country that respected the rule of law. And we made a lot of strides, and there were a lot of brave Afghans that were there on our side. But at the end of the day, it was the Afghans themselves that had to build their own country, that had to secure their freedom, to secure their democracy. We were there to help them. And we came up with a brave peace agreement at the end of the Trump administration. That peace agreement led to no combat deaths for Americans in Afghanistan for almost an entire year, something I'm proud of. I know Secretary Pompeo is proud of it. And when we left office, there were 2,500 American troops there, 5,000 NATO troops, and there was a peace process in place between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban. And unfortunately, like in Vietnam, once a president left, like when Nixon left and when Ford could no longer get the funding he needed from Congress to support our South Vietnamese allies, when President Trump left, when his national security team with Mike and Radcliffe and myself and Haspel and others left, that the stiffening mechanism, that ability to help the Afghans fight for their freedom evaporated. And so like in Vietnam, we lost a war that we'd made great advances in with blood and treasure. But again, at the end of the day, like in Vietnam, Afghanistan was a case of the Afghans having to want it themselves more than we did. And unfortunately, there were too many folks in Afghanistan that weren't willing to fight and lay down the last full measure of devotion. Many were, but they didn't have enough to stop the tide of the Taliban at the end.
Well, Bridge, I know that Vietnam is one of your favorite topics, and there are a lot of strands to pull here. We'll try to get to as many as possible in this seminar. We hope we have a lively debate tonight. But on that parallel with the Afghans and their will to fight to make the ultimate sacrifice, is there a parallel here also with Vietnam that the French, not to beat up on the French, but it can be fun, that they were not prepared really for self-rule. And so when the communists and Ho Chi Minh tried to come in, well, they couldn't fight back properly, that they needed our help to push back that wave.
Well, thanks, Mary. It's great to be with everyone this evening. And I think Vietnam is just a conflict and a topic that I do think American people, but certainly American national security decision makers would do well to kind of, study and reflect on. It was such a dominating part of our mindset. Obviously, President Nixon felt so much of the brunt of that. But it's kind of fading with the generations. I mean, obviously, you have people who are older who served there, but younger generations, it's not nearly the kind of searing experience that it was for Americans. And I think what to me is so important about it, and I think President Nixon was really astute about this, was trying to always reconcile, what our strategic interests were in the world, but also a sense of what the American people would sustain. And the sort of tragedy that President Nixon and his team, but President Nixon himself personally, was that he did not preside over the initiation or the initial years of that war, which, there's still debate about it, but, under General Westmoreland and President Johnson's administration, pursued search and destroy missions and so forth. And in a sense, I think you could say wasted American resolve and support for the war. The war in Vietnam was very popular in 1965, 66, 67. But by the time President Nixon, President Johnson decided not to run for re-election, a historic decision because of Vietnam, basically. By the time President Nixon got in there, he was bearing an albatross that was not of his own making. And I think that, in a sense, that helps contribute to, the ultimate tragedy of his presidency and so forth. But I think he deserves a lot of credit. And I think there is an element in, there's an argument that, through the policies of Vietnamization under people like General Abrams in South Vietnam, and the willingness to do very controversial things at the time, like the invasion or intervention into Cambodia and Laos, the bombings of North Vietnam, the unrestricted bombings of North Vietnam, Linebacker 2 and so forth, and Dewey Canyon, if I remember the operations correctly. That by January 1973, although the peace agreement was very imperfect, North Vietnamese forces were still in South Vietnamese territory. It gave the South Vietnamese a fighting chance, and they had done well in the Easter Offensive of 1972. But of course, with Watergate and so forth, Congress turned against support for the war. And I think as Secretary Pompeo rightly puts it, there are multiple reasons why that happened. It can't all be blamed on Congress. It reflected the will of the American people. But I think the lesson here is, we should be, we as the American people and strategic kind of thinkers and decision makers, we should really be careful and judicious and strategic, not only in the use of American force, but also of American willpower and political support. And I think that's one of the real lessons of Vietnam. The other is something we've talked about before, which is in order to get peace, sometimes you need to escalate. And I think the story of 1972, in some ways 1970, and the war in Cambodia are examples where President Nixon and his team were willing to do aggressive things precisely to de-escalate the war. And at least in the time, it seemed to have worked. In retrospect, it didn't work. But who knows what the alternate history would have been.
I always defer to the co-chairs. So if Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Bryan want to jump in, just jump in and talk over me. But until you do, I do want to go over to Nadia Shadlow, like Matt Pottinger, former Deputy National Security Advisor, and dig in on this point of public support and how do you gauge it? Nixon said, American leaders cannot wage war without the solid support of public opinion, and the American people will go to war only if they're convinced it's a just cause. Nadia, how do you measure that when you were looking, from the White House at that situation in Afghanistan? How do you gauge support for the war and whether or not you should pay heed to it or ignore it?
Thanks, Mary. I mean, I think I'll take a little bit of a different tack because I think partly public support we've seen is very much linked to leadership and to the explanation of a war. So it very much depends on your political leaders and how they explain a war and what's at stake. But I think there are 4 aspects of Vietnam that were relevant to Afghanistan and also relevant to whether or not a public is likely to support a war. Partly it's going in and recognizing these consistent features of war. One I'll call strategic depth, right? So Vietnam, for a long time, until President Nixon came into power, there was the problem of North Vietnamese supply lines, right? Not being cut off in Laos and Cambodia, right? So that was very important. We see a parallel in Afghanistan vis-a-vis Pakistan, right? And we probably even see a parallel today in terms of Ukraine and Russia and the strategic depth that Russia has. Second, stabilization matters in war. And this is where we get into the uncomfortable situation of when do things cross over to nation building or when do things cross over to a sense of stabilization to prevent insurgencies from re-emerging in a country, let's say, to prevent terrorists from retaking hold in a country. So Congress, by not recognizing their role in that stabilization down the line in Vietnam, by pulling support in 74, 75, arguably created what we saw, the failures. So again, if there's no scientific perfect line of stabilization, but it matters. And consistently in every war that America has had to fight, our military, our Army, our Marines, our Navy have had to deal with the problem of political stabilization in war, virtually every single war. Third, coin, counterinsurgency, chords. What we learned in Vietnam about the importance of military and political integration, the chords model. Chords stood for, someone help me, what chords stood for, Matt? Do you remember? It was a really, CORDS, really important model. I'll remember it in a minute. What was interesting about that is we actually did not follow that model in Afghanistan. We did not have the level of civil and military integration that we had in Vietnam. And then fourth, to Bridges' point, there was an incrementalism, right? The problem of incrementalism. So now in the war with Ukraine and Russia, what's interesting is that the president has used his what's called drawdown authority 30 times. So there's a sense of incrementalism, which is in tension with Bridges' point about deciding what you want to do up front, providing what you need up front. And there is some risk involved in that, but the risk of incrementalism could also be escalation and failure. So I think those are 4 sort of lessons that I think about in terms of Vietnam and think that are relevant to today.
Yeah, it's such a complex topic. We can go in so many directions. Matt, you served in Afghanistan. Did what Nadia say resonate with you, particularly this idea of, that you have to win the people's hearts, not just bomb the enemy? I mean, Nixon talked about that a lot, that was something that the communists did very well in Vietnam, but that we didn't pay much attention to, and it hurt us in the long run.
Yeah, chords, I have to admit, I couldn't remember what it stood for, but I did remember that Bridge Colby's grandfather was either the director or the deputy director of it at one point, but it was the civil, it was what you're talking about, Nadia, and what you wrote about very well in your book, War and the Art of Governance, right? Which which is a great read just about how do you consolidate your battlefield victories into a political victory that can be sustained. But Mary, it's all of these things that you're hearing about. It's what Nadia is talking about, where you need to have leadership that can explain why we're making the sacrifices that we ended up making after we were attacked by Al Qaeda, which was harbored by the Taliban. NATO, which we'd never invoked the Article 5 collective defense provision of that treaty until we were attacked in 9/11. And then once you're in war, it's critical that you try to build a narrative and that is going to carry the local population along with a new government. And so it was very painful that Afghanistan ended the way that it did. I don't think it had to end that way, and I do think that there are ways for us to keep a government in place with the minimal U.S. effort, an effort again of Americans providing material support and diplomatic support and some military support in order to prevent, a return to the status quo ante, where you've got terrorists harboring in this remote country. Ukraine, it's a similar scenario in the sense that what Nadia just said struck me, the idea of the strategic defense. We're now seeing the Wall Street Journal over the weekend had a good report citing data from a civil society organization called C4ADS, which found that China is providing an increasing amount of material support for Russia's war against Europe. We should not make the same mistake that we made by permitting Pakistan to become really the safe haven for the Taliban and other terrorist elements. We should not allow China to provide that kind of strategic depth to allow Putin to prosecute this war against Europe and to try to fulfill his dream of building a new Russian empire. President Biden's threatened early in, a year ago when the invasion, the re-invasion occurred. He made a very good statement saying that he was going to hit China hard. In fact, he told Xi Jinping in a call that he would hit China if China provided that kind of material support to Russia. That material support is now happening, and so the piecemeal sanctions of just these obscure Chinese companies is clearly not going to be sufficient. I think it needs to be a more systemic signal and action that the United States takes in order to impose costs on China's meddling and trying to sow chaos in Europe.
So lots of lessons here, and we're only 20 minutes in. To Bridget's point, to actually get peace, you may need to escalate. You need public support. Nadia is raising the issue of strategic depth, as you say, Matt, of stabilization, of effective counterinsurgency tactics, and also the danger of incrementalism. So I'm going to hand all of that over to you, Alex Wong, because you wanted to jump in. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, all great topics. All we could spend hours talking about all the items that people have brought up. I did want to go back to that term "just war" that President Nixon used and that you asked about, Mary, and trying to define that. And look, there are moral philosophical definitions and theories. There are political science theories that you could apply to that term. But at the end of the day, it is a political question. It is one that the American people, through our democracy, through the debates in Congress, come to a determination of what is just, what should we take up arms to defend. And I think the American people have a very finely tuned ear for this. It's multiple motivations, multiple feelings, but they come generally to the right decision on the mix of our interests as well as the ideals that we want to defend across the world when we do take up arms. So it's incumbent upon leaders to explain the reasons why they go to war, as people have said, but also to listen to the American people, to keep an ear to that political ground. Now, this is described and I think viewed by many of our adversaries around the world who are not democracies as a weakness, as a liability for democratic leaders as they try to prosecute war. I actually think it's an advantage in the long term. As the political leaders stay attuned to the people of the country, they can make smarter decisions, strategic decisions, whether to press forward or move back. If you're a dictator, the gap between you and the people is wider, and perhaps we're seeing that right now in Russia. You see the body bags or you hear about them anecdotally, at least, that are going back to Russia or not going back at all. You hear about the hundreds of thousands of fighting age men who are trying to leave Russia. That's signs to me that there's a strong disconnect between the Russian population and the decisions being made by Vladimir Putin and with his war and his invasion in Ukraine. And that's a weakness for him domestically. And whether he's attuned to that or can be attuned to that with the information systems he has going up to him, and whether he's even able to or cares to make decisions, taking that into account, that is a liability for him. And it's a strength for us that we have a democracy informing the strategic decisions of our leaders.
Yeah, but bad regimes can fight on for a long time, Alex. And now I'm going to put the secretary on the spot. Matt raised the role of China. China was instrumental in propping up Ho Chi Minh and arming the North Vietnamese. And now you see, a different iteration of communist leadership in Beijing, as Matt pointed out, backing the aggression against Ukraine. So how do you think about those parallels and the lessons that we might have learned from how the communists intervened in Vietnam and how they're intervening now?
Yeah, certainly true. We've seen this in the Chinese Communist Party. We shouldn't forget that they were around Afghanistan and too. Neighborhoods pretty darn close. Close support, financial support for Pakistan throughout the whole thing that was among the Achilles heels of our efforts in Afghanistan. So I guess we've talked about 3 conflicts, and the Chinese Communist Party is now 3 for 3. I wanted to add to something I think that Matt and Nadia were both getting at. There is a difference, too, in how information flows today. But I think one thing comes when you read the histories of Vietnam, the American public, and frankly the public around the world, often it gets boiled down to 2 words: troop strength. It used to frustrate me enormously in Afghanistan. The entire debate would be about how many boots do you have on the ground, and yet it didn't remotely reflect the nuance, the texture of all the things that we were trying to achieve, the political ends that we had, the diplomatic efforts we were engaged in. This was certainly true in Vietnam as well. These conflicts don't happen in a vacuum. We've talked about China, but Europe, broader Asia, are involved in each of these as well. Look at the conflict today that's taking place in Libya. Everybody and their brothers sent weapons there, frankly, except us. These conflicts almost always take place against a complex geopolitical backdrop. And to bring it down to what the New York Times or Washington Post will write is that 300 more soldiers today in Syria, 150 more soldiers today in Afghanistan, is a disservice to the American people. And this is where we get back to what Nadia was speaking to. Leaders have a responsibility to tell that story, to narrate factually the purpose and the resources that are being required to actually achieve that purpose, and give it to the American people in a candid, straightforward way. And then you get to Alex's point. American people are pretty good at taking that information on board. Different folks will sort it out in different ways, but you absolutely have to get that right. And when you get to the end, Mary, one of your first questions to me was, how do these end? They all end the same way, with some folks sitting at a table someplace, sometimes inside the country, sometimes outside the country, and making a decision based on relative power, relative strength, what can be achieved, and the ends not only of the parties actually in the conflict, in our case, the various ethnicities, the various tribes, the various groups, armed and unarmed, inside of Afghanistan or in Vietnam, the various folks, all trying to sort out for them what does stability look like in the aftermath of external intervention in our country. And those are hard conversations. We've been criticized. I've been personally criticized for, quote, the deal we struck with the Taliban many times. The deal we struck with the Taliban was structured in a way to try and preserve America's interests, in the same way that the Paris Peace Accords were designed to protect America's interests and all the sacrifice we'd made there as well. But we all, political leaders who are faced with these responsibilities, have to remember that it is almost certain that total victory will be unachievable. I can think of just a couple of examples in all of history where that was the outcome that ultimately delivered the final blow in a conflict. And so you need to be putting yourself in a position where the political leadership inside of the organization that you are trying to help be successful is sufficient. And I'll close with this. I've gone on too long. Think of Ukraine today. When this ends, President Zelensky will have the people of Ukraine turn to him and say, how the heck did we get here? Right? My sister was killed. My cousin died in combat. My city is destroyed. My children taken off to Russia. There will be lots of hard questions about how the political leadership did not achieve the objective they told them they could achieve. And so for the United States, we need to be thinking today, when this ends, and I agree, I think, with most of the folks here, although many inside my party disagree, the incrementalism, we've been too slow, too late, we haven't provided nearly enough for the Ukrainians to be, quote, victorious, end of quote. But we need to be focused, too, on the things that matter to America and how we end this in a way that creates deterrence for a time. It's never forever. Deterrence for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, not just a ceasefire for a month or 6 months. And if we get those things right, it will have turned on the fact that we built up the Ukrainian political leadership in a way that they can sustain that deterrence when it's the case that the weapon systems are no longer flowing.
There's a lot there to analyze, but to go to one of your points, which is that it's essential for leaders to explain what is going on. Richard Nixon gave several major television addresses to explain what was going on, and yet, as he, I think, rightly said, Vietnam ended up being, quote, the most lied about war in our nation's history. And he remarked on the U.S. press, he said, we advertise our faults, but they, meaning the communists, they bury theirs. And so I think it was very difficult for him to rally the American people. Ambassador O'Brien, I'll give you the hot potato. I mean, is it possible today in this media environment to do what the secretary is saying, to get out, to talk to the American people and have your message resonate if it's something that our national press just doesn't happen to agree with? And then Kim Reed, I'm coming to you.
Well, listen, it's a great question, but it also goes to this idea of winning wars. And I was on one of the popular shows last night, and the host gave a kind of a tirade that we don't win any wars anymore. And it's something that Mike echoed in his comments. And I think one of the reasons why we're not winning is because we're not using all the tools in our toolkit to win a war. We're really compartmentalizing. And it goes to Mike's point about the 350 more troops in Afghanistan, or 150 more troops to fight al-Shabaab in Somalia. And we're not looking at the big picture. So if you take Ukraine, for example, this goes to what Matt and Nadia talked about, and Alex to some extent, what's happening? We compartmentalize Ukraine. Ukraine's being supplied massively by Iran, a sworn enemy of ours, a country that wants to do no good to American citizens here and or former leaders and otherwise, that is engaged in malign activity all over the region. And they're now going to build a factory, according to press reports today, that's going to produce 6,000 drones a year in Russia. For no other reason to kill civilians and take out infrastructure in Russia, right? In Ukraine on behalf of the Russians. Now, what are we doing with Iran? We've got Rob Malley and the European diplomats, the EU diplomats, literally begging the Iranians to enter into a deal with us so that we can relax our sanctions and give the Iranians, hundreds of billions of dollars in sanctions relief at a time that they're actively engaged in a war against Ukraine, where the American taxpayers are being asked to pay greatly. That's something people don't understand, and it doesn't make any sense. But we've compartmentalized it in this idea where we can have the JCPOA and go back to the good old days, so to speak, under the Obama administration with Iran that never existed. And then we've got China. China just flew a surveillance balloon with three school buses full of collection equipment. Could have easily had an EMP in it, and floated it across our entire country. Now, they didn't float it, they maneuvered it. They drove it across the country. This didn't blow off course. This would be a maneuver by propulsion. And yet we've got John Kerry and his climate change team over in Iran, over in China, begging the Chinese to build one less coal plant a month. Just build one coal plant a month, don't build two. And if you do that and you promise by 2100 that you'll switch to green energy, we'll give you whatever you want. And the Chinese are sending massive amounts of material to the Russians and trading with them and keeping Putin afloat. So it's hard for the American people to understand that this war in Ukraine is so crucial and so critical, and we've got to make these massive sacrifices of our resources for Ukraine, when at the same time we're turning a blind eye to Iran and China. It makes no sense. So it's this compartmentalization that we can just throw a few more troops, throw another HIMARS or two, throw a Patriot system or two to Ukraine, and that'll end the war, and yet turn a blind eye to what Iran is doing and what China is doing to support Russia. It's really ridiculous, and we're not going to win the war. We're going to lose this war like we've lost other wars because we're not taking a holistic look at the problem. And if there's a war that's important enough for us to get involved in, important for us to commit our treasure and commit the blood of our young men and women from places like Kansas and Utah and Arkansas and the inner cities to go fight and die, then we ought to be able to back them up, not just with the tools that they need, the weapons, but to back them up with the diplomacy and the economic packages to ensure that our enemy is cut off from their sources of support. So I think we've got to stop this compartmentalization and this incremental approach. And if a war is worth fighting, let's fight it and win it. And get out of the kind of Vietnam syndrome, get out of this latest Afghan syndrome, and start being the United States of America again.
I'm so glad that you raised that phrase, the Vietnam syndrome. Whether it's right or wrong, the popular perception is that we lost the war in Vietnam, although President Nixon disagreed very, very strongly with that. And in Kim Reed, it does seem like it impacted how we think about war and how we think about the exercise of U.S. power. I mean, does Vietnam still echo today in the way that President Biden, as Ambassador O'Brien just said, is using a very incrementalist, very careful approach?
Absolutely, Mary. Ambassador O'Brien and I had the honor of visiting Vietnam together in 2020, and we met with then Prime Minister Phac and had some very good conversations. I brought to it, being the head of the Export-Import Bank, the importance of buying American and working with democratic nations to ensure China doesn't have overdue influence in the world. And as we look 25 minutes from now, I'll be watching closely, and I'm sure a lot of us will be watching closely what President Biden has to say during the State of the Union. I'm happy to see that for the second time, the First Lady is inviting Ambassador Oksana Markarova of Ukraine to sit in her box. So that's the main guest when it comes to foreign affairs and foreign issues, who will be one of the president's guests there. And, we know he's committed $24 billion in security assistance to Ukraine. But we now have a Republican House of Representatives. And I was up on the Hill this morning with 2 new freshman offices. We have a lot of education to do as we look at the lessons of Afghanistan and look at the lessons of Vietnam and what makes sense going forward. So I know that all of us care about that. I care about it from an economic front. And I was heartened today that the new chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Patrick McHenry, reintroduced a bill, the International Nuclear Energy Financing Act, which would give the ability for the World Bank and other international financial institutions to finance nuclear power projects. Ex-Im does that for the United States, but I think hopefully we're going to get the World Bank to be a player as we look at the hopeful outcome in Ukraine, where we want to see economic success. I also today was just with the State Secretary of the German Federal Ministry of Finance, Professor Holscher, and I asked her this very question because I told her, I'm focused on Ukrainian economic recovery and prosperity, and she nailed it, and I was happy to hear when she said we need to fill that gap through jobs and development so that China does not go into Ukraine. So I was happy to see her say that. And we know that Ukraine wants to join the EU. And I think that would be another step important to helping that country be stabilized and move in a good direction.
Well, all good points and points taken. And it sounds, Kim, and from others' comments, that it all comes back to leadership, as Secretary Pompeo so eloquently pointed out. Bridge, on that point, there's another parallel here to Vietnam, which is that Nixon really had to go to the Pentagon and force them to escalate in the way that he thought would be helpful to forcing the North Vietnamese to the table, namely, bombing the supply lines and taking other action that prior presidents just refused to take. But he really had to lean on the Pentagon to do it. Is that a lesson that, say, President Biden could learn today? I mean, he ordered the Pentagon to take down this spy balloon, and they waited a couple of days to do it. Is there a parallel there too about the relationship between the White House and other parts of the executive branch?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Mary. And I would draw kind of out your point a little bit. I mean, and this is a little bit more dour assessment than some about where the war is likely to go. Unfortunately, it seems the administration, Secretary General Stoltenberg, European officials, experts are indicating the war is likely to be protracted. I hope that's wrong. I hope there's a significant breakthrough and a settlement on favorable terms along the lines of what Secretary Pompeo was talking about. It has to be realistic. But I fear that's not where you would put your bets at this point. And I think the lesson of Vietnam here, and I mean, they're not exact parallels, obviously, so I wouldn't want to suggest they are. But, President Eisenhower said something that I think President Nixon was fond of quoting, but that, when you're getting into a war, you don't know how it's going to develop. And I think we can see that, and we should anticipate that here. And, I think there have been some saying that, we could decisively wrap up this conflict and then focus on China. I think that's unlikely. And even if there is a decisive breakthrough, the Russians are not likely to go away. They're entering international mobilization and they're resolute. And I mean, you look at North Vietnam, I mean, the fundamental miscalculation to me on the part of the Johnson and Kennedy administration, I mean, the quote unquote best and the brightest, I mean, McNamara, Bundy, John McNaughton, all these brilliant whiz kids and so forth, was that they could manipulate North Vietnamese and Vietnamese communist opinion. And the simple fact was, as Ho Chi Minh famously said, we'll lose 10 people for every one you lose of yours and still keep going. And so, the infamous McNamara going to Hanoi and saying we made a mistake, and the North Vietnamese and the Vietnamese were like, no, we didn't make a mistake. We were prepared to do that. And so a fundamental failure to reckon, as H.R. McMaster puts it, a lack of strategic empathy, if you will, for the opponent. And I think, I don't think there's a direct, one-to-one parallel in the case of Ukraine, but there's the potential for escalation or protraction of the conflict. I think the points about negotiation that Secretary Pompeo made are very on point, and I think there is an element. And in fact, Tom Friedman, not my favorite columnist personally, but he quoted the JFK inaugural address about bear any burden and support any friend, and that phrase became infamous over the course of the Vietnam War because it was so mismatched ultimately with the conflict and with what people were willing to sustain over time, sort of ash in the mouth, to use a Kennedy phrase. Today, has the rhetoric and has now this war taken on? I mean, what the Russians are doing is evil, no question. I mean, abominable. But on the other hand, if there's going to be a political solution along the lines of what Secretary Pompeo's, and by the way, what I think the administration is starting to telegraph through friendly columnists like David Ignatius and Hal Brands, they're starting to prepare the way for this. How do you make that transition? And I think that's something in Vietnam that was a really difficult point. You go from these guys, it's a communism, monolithic communism, to saying, we're going to break that off. And I think, in that context, it is worth going back to the Weinberger or Powell doctrine. I mean, the experience of Vietnam, and there were bad elements of the Vietnam syndrome that, as President Ford said, the long national nightmare, or President Bush in his speech about Desert Storm said, we've broken the Vietnam syndrome. But there were elements of Vietnam that were chastening and made us think about it, and ultimately won the Cold War. I just a little story of my own. when I was doing the national defense strategy, I took the chance to go to see Andrew Marshall, the famous Pentagon strategist, who'd started working in the Pentagon in 1973, had been working in RAND since the 50s.
Right.
And I said, was there a way for us to win the Cold War without getting out of Vietnam? And he basically said no. And he said that we may have to do something analogous in the contemporary period to focus. And this was, one of the great strategic, minds. But I think that process of saying, what is it that we're trying to achieve? What is it that we're trying to do? What are we prepared to do? That's so critical, but it goes against the incrementalism that, to your point, is often politically feasible and easier. And I think without being, it's particularly administrations like the current one or the Obama administration, the Johnson administration, they sort of analyze everything to death. They're very process oriented, and that can lead, we Republicans make our own mistakes, but that's, I think, something important. The last thing I would say is it's worth pointing out, and thanks to Matt, I don't claim any special knowledge. You know much more about pacification, all that than you and Nadia than I do. But I would say one thing my grandfather did actually used to say is ultimately it was not barefoot guerrillas who conquered South Vietnam. It was the North Vietnamese conventional military. And so the threat can evolve over time. In 1963, David Halberstam was writing about the insurgency in South Vietnam. After Tet in particular, and in a sense, the counterinsurgency, I personally am a little skeptical of this argument. The argument people like he made and others like Bob Sorley is that the war was won in South Vietnam, but the North Vietnamese adapted. And with Soviet and Chinese support, were able to defeat South Vietnam conventionally in the context of eroding American public opinion. And to me, that just, again, I'm a little bit of a hammer and a nail on this, but it really goes to the point that decisive, overwhelming conventional military force and the ability to directly impose your will, that's very apropos in Taiwan. It's apropos in the case of Ukraine. That's what really, really matters. You can't fail to get that right. And of course, easier said than done.
Yeah, easier said than done. And it wasn't just declining American public support, Bridge. Congress pulled the money over those 2 years. So, if you're like the Afghan soldier that, suddenly doesn't have air support and you depend on air support, are you really going to, sacrifice and die? Secretary Pompeo, I heard you there in the background as Bridge was talking, and it, going back to your comments on leadership and as Bridge says, decisive action, I have not yet heard the president articulate what our goal is in our efforts to support Ukraine. It feels like we want Putin to lose, but we're not sure that we want Ukraine to win. And the same goes with China. There hasn't been a statement really to the nation at all after the spy balloon. What do we want our relationship to be? What's the goal? Are they an enemy? Are they not? What's your reaction?
Well, Mayor, I think those are true. I try not to be political here. I have been disappointed that President Biden, maybe he'll do it tonight in the State of the Union. He will lay out clearly for the American people, here's what this looks like, here's what this is likely to cost, and here's the objectives on the ground, both the tactical and strategic. But here's why this matters to the United States of America and to someone sitting in Texas or somebody sitting in Wisconsin. Make the case, or if you're not going to make the case, you will end up, as Bridge just described, you will end up having a feeling that this is the right thing, but only the capacity to do incremental change. And that seldom leads to the decisive outcomes that I think if President Biden were to lay down what really mattered, he would lay out. The challenge with China is a more complicated one, a deeper one. We began to do this. It started with the work that Nadia did, with the strategy that we laid out at the beginning of the Trump administration. First time talking about China in a fundamentally different way than we talked about China in 3 or 4 decades. And then over time, senior leaders, culminating with me, I'm here at the Nixon Library tonight giving some remarks here at the Nixon Library that laid down as best we could for the American people why this mattered, what the risks were, the dimensions of the conflict, and the things that we would have to do to go make sure that we got America back to the place that it needed to be. These are hard things. They're complicated. It's hard to stare in the face of evil and tell the American people you've got work in front of you and this won't be free or painless. But this is what leaders do. Last thought here. I can't tell you how many times I had conversations with my European counterparts. When you meet with a European foreign minister, in almost every case, they're an elected official. Unlike the Secretary of State, who was a has-been political elected official, they're still in office. They actually have constituencies. They are representing some part of their country, some party from their country. And I would tell them, you have to go make the case so that they would say, Mike, we can't spend any more money. Our people prefer more money for NHS and not for defense, or more money for the German medical system than for new Leopard tanks. And I would remind them that the American people would prefer that too, but that their task was to go do that. And I would then offer to them, it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I was willing to do it, happy to go to your home district and we can stand on a podium together and make this case. So it's not just American leaders that have to get this right as well. I wish President Ghani had been able to rally the people in Afghanistan in important ways. He never had a coalition. We ended up having to bring the Taliban to the meetings because he couldn't get them there, nor could he bring the disparate elements of Afghan political power to bear either. And so this requires political leadership not only from the United States of America for the resources we're going to provide, but American leaders that can convince political leaders that are part of this challenge to do the right thing for their constituents too.
Nadia Shadlow, can this be done without American leadership? Is there a lesson from Vietnam? Because once we started to pull aid, it fell apart. And once we left Afghanistan, it fell apart. And now we're shouldering much of the burden in the Ukraine conflict. Thoughts?
Well, American leadership is clearly necessary, but the formula for it in a way is different, right? It can't be done just with American leadership. That's how I'd put it. To Secretary Pompeo's point, right? You need to have these other countries, other countries, our allies and our partners, taking the lead as well, doing their part. And I think that was a big message of the previous administration, and a correct message, one that we're seeing. I think, to be fair, I think the Biden administration too has made it clear that they want to see the Germans out there as well, and the Poles out there as well. The Poles clearly have been out there as well. So it can't be done just with American leadership alone. That's how I put it. And I think the same as in Asia. Bridge and Matt and Alex can speak to Asia as well. We're seeing how important it is that Japan is really taking the lead and becoming much more active in the Indo-Pacific. And the landscape would look quite different today without that. So it can't be done just with American leadership. We are an important, perhaps a dominant component, but not enough. For many reasons. I don't think the American public wants that. They want to see our allies and partners doing their part.
It's a great point. Ambassador O'Brien, I just, again, want to roll it back to Vietnam and this Vietnam syndrome that has been talked about throughout this seminar. The American people haven't seen an overwhelming victory since arguably World War II, I guess the first Iraq War, which was, very much smaller in scale and size and in commitment of troops. Is there that capacity today, as President, I almost said President Pompeo, sorry, as Secretary Pompeo said, to really rally the American public and this very risk-averse Pentagon into doing things like escalating to achieve peace, as Bridge put it at the beginning. Yep, I think we're on mute, Ambassador O'Brien.
Okay, no, look, great question, Mary. I think it can be done. The question is, when is it right to rally the American people for a unconditional win? What is that conflict? I'm not sure it's Ukraine. I think it would be in Taiwan. One thing I will point out, if you want to get the history of what happened in Afghanistan, a lot of the good history, there's a new book out called Never Give an Inch, written by our friend Mike Pompeo. He's going to be hawking some books, I think, after the seminar at the Nixon Library, but New York Times bestseller. Even the journalists that don't like Mike have come out and had to give him credit for writing a heck of a book. So take a look at it. And it will give you a real feel for what it's like to be in the trenches on these issues. And they're hard issues. But when we find the right conflict, and look, I think the conflict that we're facing right now against China, we can call it a competition, but the reality is this is a struggle for our way of life. We have to make a decision. Do we want freedom? Do we want individual liberty? Do we want free speech? Do we want freedom of religion? Do we want to be able to keep and bear arms in our country? those things, it's not just about the people of China having those rights. It'd be bad enough if that was just the case and the Chinese were oppressing their people, which they've been doing, oppressing the Tibetans, oppressing the Uyghurs, oppressing the folks in Hong Kong, threatening the folks in Taiwan. But they want to expand it and have dominion over all of us. And we see with this humiliation of the balloon flight this past week, which is more of a symbol than anything. But if there's a silver lining there, maybe the American people, maybe we're not going to get the leadership we need from our elected officials to tell us what's at stake in this conflict, because Mike knows it, I know it, you know it. I think everyone on this line who served knows what we're up against. And it's a massive challenge. But maybe the American people have woken up and they're going to start to realize that there are 100 million of these balloons in our homes through TikTok. Your phone, if it's got TikTok on it, is listening to everything you say. The Chinese have your passwords, they have your data, they have your personal data. Every university where we're doing cutting edge, great research for the American people and for our students, and the reason students flock to America from all over the world, it's all being stolen. And there are Confucius Institutes at almost every major university in America. There's farmland around our military bases, our key bases in Grand Forks, North Dakota, Laughlin in Texas. And the Chinese have bought thousands of acres around and surrounded our military bases with farmland, with their own workers, with Chinese nationals coming to work on those bases. I mean, so these are just a few things. There's a list of 20 or 30 things. Nadia and Bridge and Kim and the whole team can walk through them. Mike and I could give you 200, but it would be classified. We've got to decide, is it time for us to stand up for our way of life? Do we want to acknowledge this challenge? And are we going to have a leader who's going to rally us to those challenges? And maybe we don't have a leader today who will. But I think the American people, when they understand what's at stake, are going to demand that type of a leader. And that's why we have elections. Alex talked about this. And I think the next election is going to have to be about, do we want to keep our way of life? And if it's too hard to fight for our way of life, if it's too hard to get rid of the Confucius Institutes, it's too hard to ban TikTok, too hard to tell Wall Street that they can't finance the building of a PLA Navy, then we can just give up. But I think we're going to get a leader that's going to stand up for the United States and hopefully many leaders in Congress and talk about this threat to our way of life. And maybe the humiliation of this balloon flight is going to be a wake-up call for the American people, not just on the balloon and our airspace and on the sorry state of our military, but all the other things that we face in this. It's not just a conventional war. It's a war of ideas. It's a war of technology. It's a war of finance, and we've got to be on the ball on all those fronts. And if we do, we'll prevail, and there'll be another generation that has freedom in America.
Matt Pottinger, Ambassador O'Brien just laid out what's at stake in very simple, stark, but compelling terms. President Nixon said, quote, "If we do not exercise power for the good, then there are plenty of men who would gladly exercise it for evil." Is that the kind of choice, as Ambassador O'Brien and as President Nixon said, that we face today? Do you agree?
Yeah, look, I think we're going to win because Americans, whenever I engage with regular Americans and explain a lot of things that we're talking about tonight, people get it. They get it intuitively. They're willing to stand up and fight for the things, our way of life, as Robert put it. This is the the discouraging part is that small but influential group of people who are very influential. They are influential in our universities. They're influential in our culture, in our films and in segments of business. They're the frustrating ones because they don't really want to. They don't want to face this competition, and so. But most Americans do. When they know what's at stake, they want to preserve our way of life, and that's what gives me courage and optimism.
Matt, let me stop you right there, saying courage and optimism. I know we so rarely have high notes, and we've only got just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to fit in Alex Wong before I go to the toe chairs and we wrap. Alex.
Just quickly, Secretary Pompeo highlights, tonight is the State of the Union, and with this surveillance balloon incident, it is an opportunity for Biden to put out a strong message to, as Robert said, rally the United States in this competition, in this conflict, or this new Cold War, whatever phrase you want to use, with China. And it is teed up for him because the American people are listening, but not just the American people. Xi Jinping is going to gauge his response, and our allies and our partners around the world, as they are looking at this competition, they're looking to his response. And I do think he should use terms like win, like triumph, of America at the end winning this competition. But if he uses that language, if he tries to rally and he sends a strong message, he also has to back it up with substance. And he should challenge Congress, challenge the American people, truly, to put substance resources behind the competition in terms of defense spending, really upping our defense spending and focusing it on the Indo-Pacific. On some of the things that Robert mentioned, tough regulations on investment and on technology transfer that really view this competition as existential. And a positive and strong trade agenda that turns it and casts it in a competitive valence. These are all policies that in the State of the Union at this moment, when the world and the American people are listening, Biden can lay down those challenges and see how people respond. It's an opportunity. I hope he doesn't fumble it.
Thank you, Alex. Closing comments over to the co-chairs. Ambassador O'Brien, to you for closing thoughts.
Mary, I'm optimistic about the future of this country and about the fact that we're going to stay the shining city on the hill that Ronald Reagan talked about. One of the things that gives me that optimism is, as Matt said, talking to the American people, talking to young people who serve in the military. I've had a chance to spend a lot of time with them lately, and you meet these young officers and young NCOs and enlisted folks, and they're just great Americans. They give you hope. But I'm also optimistic because of the folks who are on this panel. I mean, I look at Nadia and Alex and Matt and you and Kim, and well, there are a couple of things in common. One, they're all a lot younger than I am, and you all are. And but there's also a lot of bridge. There's a lot of firepower, intellectual firepower, moral firepower, and courage with the folks who are on tonight, but the broader panel. And I think we're going to see everybody who's on this call tonight. Maybe not me, but the rest of the crew is going to be back in government and is going to be fighting for these American values that are so dear to us and that our country's so great. So. Look, we've got a huge challenge ahead of us. We've got, somewhat wanting leadership right now when it comes to those challenges. But at the same time, I feel good about the future of the country. And again, I'm proud to watch all the folks on this call who've already contributed much and who have much to contribute in the future. And that gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you, Ambassador O'Brien. Secretary Pompeo at the Nixon Library, over to you for any closing thoughts.
Oh, I think it's been a great discussion, Robert. Not only do you know lots of those military folks, you have family members, your kids serving. Bless you, bless them, and everybody on this seminar tonight. If you have family, hug them, tell them that we all love them, we are counting on them, and that American leadership will get this right. The American people will push our country in the right direction. If our leaders are candid and honest, they will listen, they will take to heart the things that America needs to do, both abroad and at home, and I'm convinced we're going to get it right, too.
Well, thank you again, not just to our co-chairs and the seminar members, the Nixon Foundation team, but to all of you out there watching and listening. Please follow us across social media. You'll see us on your TV, hear us on your radio and your podcasts. That's it for this month's seminar of the Nixon Foundation. I'm Mary Kissel. Good night.